Our last video dealt with the structures that act as the setting for the photosynthesis story. Now we'll get into the plot, the actual reactions of photosynthesis. This video will cover the first phase of photosynthesis, called the light-dependent reactions. We're going to cover a bunch of our unit goals. Pause the video and check them out. It might seem overwhelming, but a lot of the strategies you use to manage cellular respiration will help you manage photosynthesis too. Speaking of managing cell respiration, let's start by comparing the reactions of photosynthesis to the reactions of cell respiration. Cell respiration is the breaking down of glucose, so that's a net exergonic reaction. Photosynthesis, however, is the building of glucose, which makes photosynthesis a net endergonic reaction. Here's the overall equation for aerobic cellular respiration. Glucose reacts with oxygen to give 6 carbon dioxides, 6 waters, and 36 ATPs. Let's compare that to the overall equation of photosynthesis. On paper, the reactions of aerobic cell respiration seem like the exact reverse of the reactions of photosynthesis. The main difference in these reactions is where the energy is. Respiration stores energy from glucose in the bonds of ATP. Photosynthesis stores the energy from light in the bonds of glucose. These reactions are really complementary. The products of one set of reactions, carbon dioxide and water, act as the reactants of the next set of reactions. The products of photosynthesis act as the reactants of cellular respiration. But is photosynthesis really just backwards cell respiration? I want you to think about that as we explore photosynthesis in this unit in more detail. Photosynthesis is made up of 2 separate phases, the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. The light-dependent reactions get their name because, well, they depend on light. Light energy is temporarily stored in the bonds of 2 high-energy compounds, ATP and NADPH. NADPH is a compound that works a lot like NADH. I think about NADPH as like the photosynthesis version of NADH. Anyway, NADP is an oxidizing agent, and NADPH is the reduced form of NADP. So NADPH is a high-energy electron carrier. All right, so ATP and NADPH are used to power the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is also sometimes called the light-independent reactions. Sometimes people mistakenly refer to the Calvin cycle as the dark reactions. Don't do that. You will be a biology hillbilly if you say the dark reactions. It's just plain silly, because the Calvin cycle can happen in the light or the dark. It just doesn't need the light to happen. Anyway, the energy from ATP and NADPH is used to reduce carbon dioxide to make glucose. If we had to make an equation for the light-dependent reactions, it would look like this. Light reacts with water to make ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. It's okay to not worry about the numbers for reasons that we'll learn later. Let's peel back another layer of the light-dependent reactions. Remember, the goal is to harvest light's energy and temporarily store that energy as chemical energy in the bonds of ATP and NADPH. As we'll see, the light-dependent reactions use an electron transport chain, where chlorophyll and our old friend ATP synthase are the stars of the show. In the case of photosynthesis, the electron transport chain charges up low-energy electrons and then uses the energy of those electrons to make a proton gradient and to make NADPH. Let's take a closer look at that electron transport chain and the supporting structures that make the light-dependent reactions possible. For comparison's sake, here's the electron transport chain we're familiar with from cellular respiration. There are 5 electron transporters in this chain. The respiration electron transport chain is embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane and has the job of creating a proton gradient. The energy that drives the active transport of the protons comes from the high energy electrons that are stripped from NADH and FADH2, which would feed its electrons in here. The proton gradient then flows back through ATP synthase, where the energy of the gradient is used for oxidative phosphorylation, where ADP is phosphorylated to make ATP. Old news. Here's the electron transport chain of photosynthesis. There are 7 transporters in this chain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Instead of the mitochondria, we're in the chloroplast. So here's a chloroplast, and the membrane is the thylakoid membrane. So we're way on the inside of the compartment called the stroma. Here's the thylakoid membrane, and the compartments that we want to pay attention to are the stroma on the outside of the thylakoid membrane and the thylakoid space on the inside of the thylakoid membrane. You can see that protons are built up to high levels on the inside of the thylakoid membrane here using active transport. This time, the energy for active transport is provided by light. Then, the protons flow through ATP synthase by facilitated diffusion from the thylakoid space back to the stroma. The energy from the proton gradient is used to phosphorylate ADP and make ATP. Familiar story with ATP synthase. But making ATP this way is called photophosphorylation because of the involvement of light. As soon as we say light is involved, it's important to think of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is found in the 1st and 5th transporter of the electron transport chain, called Photosystem II and Photosystem I. This is a really weird naming convention. It seems like the photosystem that comes first should be called Photosystem I, but it's called Photosystem II. But the reason that the names are kind of switched like this is because the photosystems got their names based on the order that they were discovered. Photosystem I was discovered first, but comes second in the chain. Photosystem II was discovered second, but comes first in the chain. The photosystems themselves each have around 60 individual chlorophyll pigments. Chlorophyll absorbs light's energy because of the specialized porphyrin ring head group. Chlorophyll can embed in the thylakoid membrane because chlorophyll has a nonpolar hydrocarbon tail. There are actually 2 different flavors of chlorophyll, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. You can see from this graph, a diagram called an absorption spectrum, that chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B actually absorb slightly different wavelengths of light. Chlorophyll A has absorption peaks around 400 nanometer wavelengths and a little bit closer to 675 or 700. Chlorophyll B has a peak absorption that's a little bit closer to 475 and another little bump out here at about 650. There are other light-absorbing pigments involved in photosynthesis like carotenoids that absorb different spectrums of light. Different pigments have different jobs in the photosystem. Most pigments are referred to as antenna pigments and are located kind of around the outside, shown here in this diagram, or here around the periphery in this diagram. The job of antenna pigments is to absorb light energy. Antenna pigments can be chlorophyll or carotenoids. There's one special chlorophyll, chlorophyll A, that's called the reaction center pigment. It's shown here in this diagram, here in this diagram, and here in this diagram. The special job of the reaction center pigment is to not only absorb light energy, but energize electrons before the electrons are passed along the electron transport chain. Think of the antenna pigments as kind of funneling energy down to the reaction center pigment. Another way to represent the photosystems is shown in this graphic. Low energy electrons enter the photosynthesis electron transport chain. The job of the photosystems is to energize the electrons to a high energy level. Electrons get energized twice as they pass through the photosynthesis electron transport chain. Energized first by Photosystem II and next by Photosystem I. High energy electron loses some energy, and then that electron gets energized a second time. Now that we've met the players of the light-dependent reactions, let's talk about the process of the light-dependent reactions. First, let's zoom out from looking so close at those photosystems and see our setting in its entirety. Remember, the electron transport chain is embedded in the thylakoid membrane of a thylakoid, which is in the inside compartment of a chloroplast. In the first step of the light-dependent reactions, light energy, or photons, are absorbed by the antenna pigments and bounce around from antenna pigment to antenna pigment until the energy gets to the reaction center pigment. At the reaction center pigment, electrons are energized by that electron, or by that. After energizing the electrons, the reaction center chlorophyll needs to replace the electrons it just lost. So the reaction center pigment gets new electrons by splitting water, a process called photolysis. Photo meaning light, and lysis meaning split. When water is split, the electrons are used in the electron transport chain. The hydrogens are used to help build the proton gradient, and the oxygen is a waste product. Although plants use some of the oxygen for their own aerobic cellular respiration, most of the oxygen is released into the atmosphere. That's right, the oxygen in our atmosphere largely comes from splitting water. It's pretty crazy. Anyway, let's check back in with that energized electron. The electron gets passed from one carrier to the next in a series of redox reactions. Like the redox reactions we've seen before, a little bit of energy is released with each electron transfer. The energy that's released here is used to bring two protons in from the stroma into the thylakoid space. If you're keeping track, that means we got two protons from water and two other protons from this electron transport chain. The proton gradient is used to make ATP, and that process isn't shown in this diagram, but it is shown in this diagram. So you see the protons from water, and you see the protons coming from the stroma into the thylakoid space, and these protons all flow back through ATP synthase by facilitated diffusion, flowing in a current where the power of that current provides the energy used to make ATP. Remember, this process is called photophosphorylation. All right, back to the timeline. By now, remember, the electrons were energized at Photosystem II. The high energy of the electrons was used to help make a proton gradient, and now the electrons have relatively low energy again. So Photosystem I comes into play to re-energize those electrons. Just like in Photosystem II, antenna pigments absorb light's energy, pass that light energy through other antenna pigments until the energy gets to the reaction center pigment, and the reaction center pigment chlorophyll re-energizes those electrons. The big difference here between Photosystem I and Photosystem II is that Photosystem I doesn't split water again. Photosystem I just re-energizes the same electrons. While the electrons are still high in energy, the electrons are passed along the next couple of electron transporters until the final carrier NADP reductase. NADP reductase reduces NADP to NADPH. Another way to say this is that NADP is the final electron acceptor in this electron transport chain. But hopefully you can appreciate how this carrier got its name, NADP reductase, as an enzyme that participates in a redox reaction, and that redox reaction reduces NADP to NADPH. Now we're at the end of the light-dependent reactions, so let's recap. Remember, the overall reactions for photosynthesis and aerobic cell respiration are complementary, meaning that the products of one are the reactants of the other, and vice versa. The reactions kind of feed into one another. The light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis that were the focus of this video create NADPH and ATP, two high-energy products that are used to power the second phase of photosynthesis called the Calvin cycle. The light-dependent reactions use photosystems, which are arrangements of pigments that absorb energy of light and use that energy to energize electrons, which come from water. When passed along this electron transport chain in photosynthesis, the energized electrons do two things. First, the energy is used to create a proton gradient that powers photophosphorylation and makes ATP. And second, those high-energy electrons are attached to NADP to make NADPH.